In 1968, the American Indian Movement, also known as AIM, was founded in Minneapolis, Minnesota by Dennis Banks, Russell Means, and Clyde Belcourt. They are the three main founders of AIM. Eddie Benson Benai and George Mitchell were leaders for AIM. In the United States, Indigenous people were not getting treated fairly and treaties were not being honored by the government. AIM's goal was to bring awareness to Indigenous issues and seek justice for past conflicts between the U.S. government and Indigenous peoples. Through AIM's action, they gained better education and healthcare for Indigenous people and brought a wider awareness to Indigenous rights. Today, AIM is still active. In 1783, the U.S. won independence from Great Britain and wanted to grow west. The U.S. claimed the lands that was previously claimed by Great Britain. Truly, the land belonged to hundreds of American Indian nations, so the U.S. would legally have to acquire land from these American Indian nations. The U.S. government forced treaties upon the American Indians to take control of their land. For example, the Treaty of Mendota. The U.S. government threatened to use weapons on the Mdewakanton and Wapiti bands to sign the treaty when they did not want to. The bands had to give up about 24 million acres without a choice and were promised $500,000 immediately, plus incomes of cash and two permanent reservations of land along the Minnesota River. The U.S. Senate decided to change his mind with the treaty terms that were supposed to be permanent to temporary. Another treaty forced upon American Indian nations was the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux. In 1851, the United States met up with two different groups of the Dakota to arrange land treaties. They met up with the Sisseton and Wahpeton bands of the Dakota Nation. In July 1851, the government welcomed the elders of the Dakota Nation and offered them food and money because they were in need of it. They offered food and money for land, but the government cheated the Dakota out of the money by having them sign a document which gave their money to the fur traders. The American Indians had to struggle while the U.S. was continuing to grow on their land.
The U.S. government made formal agreements and signed treaties with the Native Americans. In order to stay in their own land, the government made them give up their traditional beliefs and made them practice Christian traditions. By the 1800s, most Indian nations had agreed to sign treaties with the American government because they had no other option. In the 1800s, they weren't being treated well, and treaties were not being followed. The government made these Native Americans sign these treaties, but weren't honoring it. The U.S. government was getting too powerful and thought they could do whatever they wanted. In the 1880s to 1890s, a lot of boarding schools were being opened. Some were even on reservations. Some Native Americans sent their children because they wanted them to learn English. And some sent their children because they could not feed them, which is evidence of the treaties not being followed. Other parents refused for their children to go, but the government forced them and took them away. At the boarding schools, children had to learn the Christian religion in English. They were not allowed to speak their native language or practice their traditions. If they spoke their native language, they were beaten. The Native Americans were not happy because of the way they were being treated unequally by the federal government, and the treaties weren't being followed, even though it was their land. So a group of Native Americans met up together and discussed the critical issues so they could take control, and because of the anger and determination they had.
The formation of AIM was in 1968 in Minneapolis, Minnesota, when a group of 200 people from the Indian Community Center called out for a meeting by groups of Native American community activists led by George Mitchell, Dennis Banks, and Clyde Belcourt. In the 1960s, organized groups of the Native Americans were fighting for their rights. Then in 1968, AIM was founded to combat police mistreatment. AIM grew quickly throughout the 1960s and 1970s. Activists started beginning holding large protests and received more awareness about the issues they were facing, including treaty rights and cultural rights. Dennis Banks was born in 1937 at Leech Lake Reservation. Dennis Banks served in the U.S. Air Force. Banks had been in trouble with the police and government a lot because of certain riots and protests. Banks stated, "We have tried to deal with these people in peaceful means. We have tried to deal with the state of Minnesota and the United States in a peaceful method. Yet our American Indian people are falling day by day." Banks unfortunately passed away October 29th in 2017 from surgery complications. Clyde Belcourt was born in 1936 and recently just passed. Clyde was the seventh of 12 siblings. Eddie Benton Bonai was born in 1931. He unfortunately died November 30th, 2020. George Mitchell was born in 1936 in White Earth, Minnesota, and passed in 2015 in Maida Wash, Minnesota. In 1972, the AIM activists Dennis Banks and Russell Means and members of the Rosebud Sioux organized the Trail of Broken Treaties, an American Native quest for justice. This cross-country protest occupied the Bureau of Indian Affairs building in order for people to pay attention to American Indian rights. Unfortunately, they failed their mission to get land back, but they succeeded to get attention worldwide for people to see what they're going through. Protest caravans of automobiles would cross the nation to the White House. On October 6th, three caravans departed from Seattle, San Francisco, and LA. The caravans were accompanied with Native spiritual leaders and passed through several reservations on their way to Washington. At each stop, they would make the AIM activists hold drum circles and workshops to gain their support for their Red Power protests. They had about 200 tribes join them. Fun facts, their caravans eventually passed through St. Paul, Minnesota. They protested to get about 110 million acres of land back to the indigenous communities. AIM got tons of media attention so it could help them get the attention they deserved. AIM and plenty other Indian Americans kept driving until they got to their destination, Washington, D.C. They built teepees on the BIA lawn so they could promote their Trail of Broken Treaties manifesto. They finally got the peaceful occupation of the BIA President Nixon, who sent three top officials to negotiate with AIM.
Protesting and occupations in the 1970s brought public attention to issues facing Native Americans. Even though the American government rarely returned any land, Native American activists did make some recognition of treaties, education, social rights, and religious freedom. In 1972, the Indian Education Act reaffirmed the government's responsibility to meet the educational needs of Native Americans. In 1976, the Indian Health Care Improvement Act got better funding for American Indian health care. And in 1978, the Indian Child Welfare Act recognized the rights of tribes regarding their children. The protests of AIM got public awareness, which got better education for Native Americans, their religious traditions back, and better health care for them. After the protests in Washington, D.C., President Nixon decided to listen and sent three of the top BIA officials to negotiate with AIM activists. They all agreed to form a task to consider the 20-point manifesto and conduct a 6-month review of the Indian policy and provide $66,650 for them to get back home safely. Even though the demands made in the Trail of Broken Treaties manifesto were originally rejected by the task force, the 20-point plan became the new foundation for President Nixon's self-determination policy. Unfortunately, they did not get what they wanted and what they deserved, but they were not done fighting for their people. Many years later, AIM got Native Americans barely any land, just quiet parts of some states. Although, AIM got more awareness about indigenous issues. For example, many protesters at Line 3, which is an oil pipeline that ran through indigenous land. People raising money for bail funds, funding money for food and hygienic products for people protesting that were staying there for months at the Line 3 site. Also proper schooling, good health care, and they were able to practice their religion. The 50th anniversary of AIM was in 2019, marking the day of the 1969 Alcatraz occupation. 19 months of special events took place in honor of the occupation, one event every second day of the month, as well as an exhibition named Red Power on Alcatraz, Perspectives 50 Years Later. AIM is important in history so we can remember the change the movement made, and so we can keep fighting for Indigenous rights. AIM is also important because without AIM, Indigenous people wouldn't have things like good health care and good education.